evening we will continue our consideration of the principles underlying the principal yogas of Indian philosophy. This evening our subject is Bhakti Yoga. And here we come to a different level of our inquiry. As I have mentioned in some lectures, we recognize that the emotional life of the human being is deeper and older than his mental experience. And as a result of this, the authority of the emotion in the conduct of man is more direct, more forceful than the authority of the intellect. For that reason, we observe that in practical living, the mind is largely used by the average person as a servant of his emotional pressures. The person says, I like this person. This is immediate and emotional acceptance. Then the question arises, why do I like this person? And immediately the mind begins the work of justifying the original impulse. It creates an excellent defense for the emotion. It justifies, proves, demonstrates in 100 ways that the emotional impact was legitimate, was true. We then say, I do not like this person. And immediately the mind goes to work on a more critical basis to seek out reasons why we do not like that person. If these reasons are not immediately available, they are conjured into existence by interpretation and by the gradual reading into evidence such meaning, such intention as we require to be there. Thus we easily observe early in the study of mind phenomena that the intellect has a definite tendency to depart from fact and to act as a justification for our emotional conceptions and preconceptions. As a result of this tendency, we are frequently confronted with mental illusion, in which the mind, forced to fulfill the requirements of the emotions, must fabricate, must even extend itself into illusion and hallucination in order to sustain the original attitudes of emotional pressure. Thus the mind becomes, to a large degree, a mirror of our emotional life and a guardian or protector of such emotional attitudes as we may choose to hold. On this basis, then, it is only reasonable that any method of human improvement, any discipline for the advancement of man's spiritual and conscious society, should, to a degree, consider emotional phenomena, and should include within its disciplines a means of refining the emotions, even as we seek means for regenerating the body and redeeming the mental processes. As the mind must be led from error to wisdom, so the emotions must be led from excess to moderation. And this process of moderating emotional intensity is one of the basic concepts involved in Bhakti Yoga. Now, we recognize also the importance of human love. And we know that love represents one of the most positive and intense of the human emotions. We realize also that in matters pertaining to intensity of affection, the mind is obviously at a disadvantage, and therefore most evidently only occupies a secondary position. It attempts to prove, justify, and sustain the intensities of the affections, but it cannot successfully withstand them, nor can it rationalize successfully against their intensities. We have evidence of this in human relationships constantly. Pythagoras, who was initiated in India, finally declared that there are only three possible relations between living things. That is, especially between the members of the human family. These relations were the relation of parents, the relation of husband-wife, and the relation of the child. The husband-wife relation also carried on its own level brother and sister relation. The relations were parental, which meant a relation to superiors in dignity, age, esteem. Affection to equals, husband, wife, brother, sister. And affection to the young, or those intellectually or spiritually immature, children. Thus, in human relationships, as Pythagoras expressed it, in viewing others, all human beings were either his parents, his brothers, sisters, or his children. Now, this meant, on an emotional level, three kinds of affection, or three qualities of love. The first of these was the love of the individual for superiors, whether these superiors be his physical parents, his spiritual instructors, the older and wiser members of his own race, or the love and adoration of divine beings. These together form a group consisting of spiritual or venerated superiors. Then there was the love of equal, those whose wisdom, knowledge, understanding were equal to his own. This was the kind of love that we share with those of our own generation, those upon our own standards of life and thinking. Then there was the love for the young, in which the person takes a naturally parental attitude toward youth, toward inexperience, toward those spiritually, intellectually, or physically uncultivated, and therefore in need of guidance and direction. The affection to the parent or to the superior being was that of adoration, the giving of self to the superior. The affection toward those of equal status was that of sharing, and the affection to those who were younger was the love of bestowing. And these became the three principal kinds of human affection. And these affections become the instruments or the elements of a great philosophical system, a system based upon the refinement of man's emotional and spiritual nature. Love, per se, as an emotion, has never been adequately defined. Plotinus, in his essay on the beautiful, was of the opinion that love was the instinct toward union of separated or divided parts. Therefore, that love is the instinct toward wholeness, toward completeness, toward the reunion or the attainment of yoga, which is union. Therefore, the love of our own fellow kind means to find union, to find sympathy, to find kindred with them. Whereas the love of the divine means the aspiration to attain union with the divine and to share the experience of bestowing. the bestowing of self upon that which is superior to self, or the bestowing of self upon that which is in great need, and therefore requires our help, guidance, or kindness. In religion, we hear a great deal about love, but for the most part, we have not recognized that this emotion, like mentation on its various levels, must pass through certain disciplines or refinements if we are to elevate consciousness toward reality. We cannot, therefore, love divine things carnally, nor can we love carnal things divinely. And in the Western cultural system of which we are a part, there has been no differentiation of the basic emotion of love. We assume that we can transfer this emotion from various levels to other levels without any essential refinement or transmutation of the emotion itself. This is a very serious mistake and has led to a great many religious difficulties. For when a love which is still of a physical quality is turned upon divine things, it cannot fulfill its natural purpose, because it is not sufficiently refined in itself to be able to sustain the consciousness above the material level of things. Thus we begin to consider the problem of the refinement of human affection and how we shall go about it. And to a large degree, this is carried in the great department of knowledge which is called religion. For religion is essentially working with the emotion principle in man. And this emotion principle must be cultivated, must be regenerated, or as Buddhism says, must be transmuted from passion to compassion before the individual is liberated from the personal pressures of personal emotion. Now in the West, we are not inclined to regard personal emotions as in any way reprehensible. And in sober fact, they are not. Actually, personal emotions are as natural and normal to our kind as any other of the natural sensory and functional powers of man. Personal emotions, upon their own levels, have their utilities and their values, and we should not regard the neurotic frustration of these emotions as a spiritual achievement. Actually, it is a very dangerous thing to do, a procedure that is always fraught with disaster. But recognizing that we do have physical emotions, how are we going to use them constructively? Emotions are directed and moved by a center of consciousness within ourselves. Consciousness operating through emotion manifests a phase of its own energy, just as it manifests another phase of that energy through mental activity. Furthermore, as we go out into the abstractions of life, we realize that in the universe, love and law are identical. The individual who mentally experiences a law as something to obey experiences this law emotionally as something to adore. This instinct to obey is the consummation of rationalization. The instinct to adore is the consummation of the emotional instinct in the individual in relating to divine matters. Thus, there is no essential difference in the universe between love and law. One does not frustrate or neutralize the other, nor is there conflict between them. Actually, they are the mental and emotional response to one eternal and enduring fact. Mysticism has always emphasized the emotional agent as a means of bridging the interval between human and divine consciousness. Mysticism, therefore, springs out of adoration. It arises from the emotional impact of the divine presence. Thus, mysticism is of its own nature and by its own peculiar virtue, grounded in acceptances, in faith, and in hope, and in love, and in those reflexes which are essentially pointed toward adoration. The mystical experience is therefore essentially an emotional experience, and for that reason it is difficult, if not impossible, to interpret it intellectually. That we also have a serious break in our own psychic life between our mental and emotional natures is all too obvious. That which we mentally define, we very seldom emotionally vitalize. And what we emotionally vitalize in its own nature, we find great difficulty in mentally defining. This interval means that we are dealing with two distinct groups of energies, although today psychology lists them together as one structure. This, it seems to me, is the result of a shortcoming in the psychological perspective, because actually these two are distinct energies of consciousness. They are not merely polarities of each other, or aspects of each other, or conditions of each other. In the Eastern disciplines, therefore, we begin by a consideration of how we shall refine the emotional attitudes. How we shall take love which we have, a very personal, selfish kind of love, a self-centered kind of love, a love that sort of shares between loving others a little and loving self the more, in most instances. Actually, the average person is more fond of himself than of any other living thing. Occasionally, we get a departure from this, but it is usually represented as an outstanding virtue, because the average person does not experience it immediately in his emotional relationships. Love, on the human level, is essentially a love which desires to possess. And this arises completely from the Western concept that man can possess. Now, in love, we exercise a tyranny, and very often those around us find our affections a bondage. Often these affections become so excessively dominating, so intensely personal, that they really work a hardship upon our living. Yet we are so constituted that we rather expect it to be this way. We suspect unselfishness as lack of affections, and we doubt the individual's personal devotion if he does not express it by action of a possessive nature. In the East, however, we have a little different approach to this. The Easterner thinks of love not as the emotion to possess, but the emotion to release. He feels that the greatest personal devotion that he can express on a human level is that of freeing things, freeing them from him if necessary, but certainly creating the quality of freedom. Also assuming with some of the Greek philosophers that man keeps closest to himself that which he most generously releases. We are not so likely to lose those we release as those we hold on to. And because we have released by an understanding within ourselves, we are also free from the pain of loss, free from the selfish sorrows, griefs, and disturbances which rise from the sense of possession. Possession is not essentially a mental quality. Possession is an emotional impulse, an instinct. The desire to conquer the world is not basically mental. It is emotional. The mind then sets in and creates the strategy by which this emotion may be fulfilled. But the desire is basically an emotion. Anything to which the term desire may be correctly applied is emotional. Thus, in the East, the beginning of the sublimation of emotion is the gradual internal realization of release. That the individual does not desire to possess, that he does not desire to bring to himself and to control that which he loves. Rather, he is impelled and inspired to generously give of his affection in a manner to create freedom for the thing loved. Now, this does not necessarily mean indifference. It does not mean that there is no longer interest, service, understanding, kinship. It means rather that the individual can say honestly, when he thinks he wishes to help someone else, that he wishes to help them to do the things that they want to do, rather than the things he wants them to do. And there's a great difference in these processes in practical experience. Usually our desire for love is expressed by the fact that we know best. Therefore, those whom we love, we must protect by causing them to do the things we want them to do. If, looking through our own lives, we find that our own judgment has been poor, and that probably they will not do well by doing the things we want them to do, such does not concern us. It's the instinctive desire to dominate, the instinctive desire to regulate the lives of others. We call this instinct love, but actually it is not, because love suffereth long and is kind. And most human love does not suffer long and is not overly kind. There is, however, experience which gradually deepens human values and human emotional reactions. And there is a common ground that is established between the mind and the emotions in the field of understanding. An understanding, in this case, is an apperception of value. Understanding is the power to estimate impersonally the natural and real values of things. So understanding begins the process of redeeming or regenerating love. And in this process, we bring to bear upon the objects of our emotions not only our instinctive and pressureful intensities, but also a certain reflection, a certain internal morality, conscience, a consciousness portion, by which we begin to say to ourselves, it is better to give than to receive. It is wiser to be kind than to be overly severe. And little by little, we temper our own intensities through the results of experience and through interpreting the actions of others to us, these interpretations being based upon how we have felt when others conducted themselves in certain ways. So our understanding begins the process of refining the affections of the human being. And refined from within, not by a demand, but by a growth, causes us to see that love, like mine, can grow. And that the growth of love, through the cultivation of it, through the realization of its true meaning and importance, that this growth brings to us an emotional maturity, and that we therefore can advance from one level of affection to another, deepening, enriching, broadening the program of our emotions. Now, there is a point that has been often brought up in connection with these matters, namely that the emotions of man are primeval, that they are strongly atavistic, and that under tremendous pressure the individual breaks back and begins to reveal the most primitive emotional instincts of the jungle. That emotions are not as easily controllable. They are not as easily directed. And in anger, for example, the veneer of civilization and perchance years of acquired attitudes dissolve. The individual returns again to the immediate emotional level of his own internal life. This does not necessarily follow in all cases, but it is true that the emotional life of the individual has been for centuries under powerful moral control, and therefore that all of his emotional maturity as he experiences it today is not real. Part of it is acquired rather than innate, and this acquired part can be removed by pressure, and the original pressures can break through. Thus, in all matters of affection, there is a tendency to recognize that the individual is within himself more intense, more personal, more selfish, more self-centered than perhaps he even would like to admit that he is. And that it is only when he is able to keep his emotions in reasonable control that he is able to maintain the platform of culture to which he seems to belong. This continues because, largely, man's emotional life has been uncultivated. Just as the undisciplined child is not trustworthy, as the untrained mind is not accurate, so the uncontrolled emotions are not dependable. Thus it becomes obvious, under stress, that we need greater emotional discipline than the average person has ever received. And that this emotional discipline is not going to be matured merely by the fact of living. That to bring it to a reasonable degree of integration, the individual must make a distinct program out of maturing his own emotional life. How do we mature it? We do not mature anything by a forcing process, nor can we mature emotions by good reading. Nor can we mature emotions simply by refusing to give expression to undesirable ones or attempting to cultivate constructive emotional habits. These will help to a degree, but they are not the solution to the problem. The emotional life of man comes from a totality within himself. The emotional pressure bears witness to a larger part of man than his mental attitudes. Emotional pressures come from a much deeper ground, from a much older ground. Therefore, emotional maturity arises largely from the improvement of the whole person, rather than from a special discipline upon some part of the personality. We may train the hands to play the piano. We may train the mind to add a mathematical table. But if we wish to unfold the emotions, we must move from a complete and total picture. We must move from a larger foundation in elevating emotional life. This is one of the important ideas that are to be found in the writings of Confucius. In his school in China, Confucius did not believe in the development of specialized education. He did not believe that wisdom arose from the perfection of the individual in any department of his life, but in the raising of the whole level of his being. Therefore, Confucius instructed his disciples in many subjects. He invited them to consider a variety of refinements, realizing that everything that they gained in the form of useful knowledge and understanding would have a part to play in the totality of their emotional pressure. Thus, for example, he would teach the scholar to paint. He would teach the musician to ride horseback. He would teach the mystic to mend his own garments. It was a totality that was wanted. not simply a specialization of certain knowledge. In the yogic concept, affection moved with understanding of values. For example, a mother's love for her child can be very personal and very intense, and usually is, unless there are some unnatural or unreasonable circumstances. Yet the mother's love for the child can be the undoing of the child, unless the mother herself has a certain sense of values along with this intensity of affection. The mother who through her love spoils her child has not loved the child at all. That is the difficult thing to realize. Because love, in this case, has usually been adulterated by ulterior motives. One of the most common reasons for spoiling children is that children are a little difficult, and unless you get into them more often than you should, your own composure is damaged. You haven't quite as much time to do the things you wanted to do. The child who is jumping up and down, stamping its feet, and making a general nuisance of itself is disagreeable to the parent. The parent does not like to be uncomfortable, does not like to be annoyed, does not like to be faced with a scene, does not like to be accused of cruelty and meanness and all these kinds of things. So, rather for its own sake than for the sake of the child, it gives in, though perhaps fully knowing that it should not do so. It may gain a great reputation for kindliness and love, but actually these emotions are not what are involved. More thoughtfulness shows that such is not the case. What then is the proper relation of affection to the child? The answer is that the greater affection is that which serves the greater need of the child, from whatever perspective and level the parent may occupy. It is the utter consideration of the child's greater good that represents our highest conviction of what we should call love for that child. Yet in practice, we do not give that sufficient thought, because it is a little difficult and it's a little time-consuming, and it may require that we make greater change in our own lives in order to prove that we love the child. Most children, who are called problem children, are really children with problems. And this, in many cases, is directly traceable to the parents. Therefore, instead of the parent giving the child the toy, the bottle, the ice cream cone, the money, or whatever may be involved that the child is screaming for, and in that way stopping the uproar, at least temporarily, and establishing a precedent which will be followed by much more uproar in the course of time. The really loving parent, or the parent who really cares for the child, might say to himself or herself, why is the child like this? And might discover that the lack of harmony between the parents is a strong responsibility in this matter. Therefore, love for the child means that the parents should learn to love each other and give the example. But that is a large, big fact. That doesn't look like love. That looks like martyrdom. So that actually all of the love that we talk about is already evaporated. And instead of this tremendous amount of affection being showered in all directions, we see a group of selfish people perverting principles and substituting appearances for realities. Thus, in the Oriental system, we can say, let's get at this subject of love. Let's try to find out what it really means. Let us also realize how easily this peculiarly sensitive thing can be destroyed, how it can be exploited, how it can be prostituted in 1,000 ways, under a cloak of respectability that is never questioned by the public, because the public just doesn't know any better and it's doing the same thing anyway. But But where is your true love in this pattern? It is essentially missing. And yet, if you accuse these various persons of being without this emotion, they would be righteously indignant. In the East, then, the question arises to discover at first what is love. How does it work? What are its duties and its purposes? And why has man been given this tremendous emotional capacity and yet left with this capacity so completely immature? Well, we can go a little further in this thinking, and we can say that men love each other to a degree under the heading of friendship. And yet this friendship can very quickly be corrupted into patronage. And we find the lack of the courage of the friend to correct the friend to be honest with the friend to be useful rather than merely being agreeable. Here our love in practice is a very negative thing rather than a positive one because we fear that we will offend. Therefore, we are unfair because we do not wish to offend. Our love is not strong enough to stand this strain, and the love of our friend is not strong enough for him to stand the strain if we tell the truth. So everything gets very strange. Then we go on and we consider the love of God. Now, the average human being, the love of God, is a very mysterious thing. One of the great problems in affection and adoration, veneration, all these things, is that the object of this affection must be understandable, must be in some way apperceivable by ourselves. And in the love of God, we are loving something that is completely beyond our ordinary experience. We are loving a vast abstraction. And what we call the love that we bestow upon it is another vast abstraction. Not knowing what love is, and not knowing what God is, we love God. We cannot define our emotion towards Him. And the only way in which we can integrate it at all is to base our affection upon a personal devotion. Perhaps we had a parent whom we sincerely loved. Therefore, we have an experience which we can transfer to an invisible, unknown person, the abstract being of deity. And our love for God becomes merely an extension, or, to a degree, a sublimation of our love for father or mother, or our love for our country, or our love for beauty and other things of which we have some understanding and recognition. But the problem of how should deity be adored has always been a very great one, because in popular religion, as we know it today, we are really too much like children worshipping a parent. Because not only does the parent signify strength, but the parent signifies refuge. It signifies security. It signifies the fulfillment of our desires. And because of the level of our affection, we have gradually transformed deity into a benevolent power that acts as a kind of patron or a universal philanthropist, forever attempting or presumed to attempt the fulfillment of our desires. Thus we pray to God for health, we pray for wealth, we pray for wisdom, we pray for long life, we pray for our own success, not infrequently for the consternation of our adversaries. We wish no ill to ourselves and very little good to others. And we assume and expect that this parent, who is the abstract counterpart of the doting ancestor in our own domestic pattern, will be responsive to us in these various ways. We turn to God not to give, but to get. not to bestow, but to receive. We are not worried about protecting God. We are much more worried about God protecting us. And little by little, we turn to deity as a benefactor, rather than as a universal power to which we owe certain responsibilities and allegiances. In yoga, comes the process then of gradually learning to experience a divine nature as an impact upon the self. In Bhakti Yoga, as in the other yogas, love becomes a universal power. Under such a name as Ishvara, it is a deity, a being, an all-permeating, all-penetrating, omnipresent, omniactive power. This love is everywhere abundant and superabundant. Therefore, the individual is given the possibility of seeking the experience of this love, seeking the experience of the discovery of it, not by intellection alone, but by realization, by meditation, or the continuing remembrance of the presence of the divine. We have the same concept entirely in the Near Eastern mystics, the Sufis and the dervishes, where the beloved represents universal love, deity as the infinite energy of love itself. So in the disciplines of Bhakti Yoga, the individual gradually comes to be receptive to the presence of divine love. Now, before he can become receptive to the presence of divine love, he has to get the evil out of things. And that is the first, most difficult step perhaps there is. We are so inclined to regard all things suspiciously. We are so likely, in looking around us, to be displeased, to be antagonized, to say to ourselves, all the evidence that I can accumulate points to disaster, to tyranny, to cruelty, to selfishness. How then can I, as a person, having lived a life that is arduous, toil-worn, and burdened with disappointments and disillusionments, how am I to immediately apperceive the omniscience and omnipresence of divine love? The individual may say, I never received any affection from my parents. I've never received any from my children. I've had very little from the world. How then shall I discover this power to be omnipresent in all things? This is a good question. But it is a question that can be answered, but it must be answered validly. And it must perhaps be answered by a combination at first of mental and emotional factors. Remembering that the desire to love is an emotional instinct, and realizing that the mind's duty is to preserve and maintain the testimony of the emotion, we can gradually and gently bring the mind to the degree that it will defend the emotions in their positive and constructive aspects. In yoga, the disciple learns that the moment he looks for love with an open heart, he will find it. So the difficulty has been that he hoped for love but looked for and expected hate. That he hoped understanding but expected to be misunderstood. Thus, with a subconscious doubt deeper than the conscious resolution, the doubt ultimately won. In order to have the kind of mystical experience that is involved in yoga, the individual must begin the gradual process of integrating a positive power of apperception. His first difficulty is, of course, that he is unable to recognize love. He can recognize the human passions with which he is familiar. He can recognize what passes in the currency of love among mortals. But that kind of love, which is universal, he has neither experienced nor known. Therefore, he can look at it and not see it, because it may or may not resemble that which he expects. Like the small boy who wants the ice cream cone, but which cone should not be given to him because of the possible danger to his basic health. A series of ice cream cones, of course, many a small boy in tonsils before it was all said and done. But the little boy who wants an ice cream cone, asks for it and gets it, has discovered parental love. He wanted it, they gave it to him. Obviously, they love him. Now, the wiser parent says, no, you can only have one ice cream cone each. You can't have one every time you have one. Immediately, the small boy discovers the absence of love. He does not get what he wants. Therefore, to borrow Kipling, the bottom is out of the universe. His parents are mean, nasty ogres. There's nothing nice about them. 25 years later, the boy who got the ice cream cones when he shouldn't have had will sit down and realize that his parents were rather stupid, and he wishes that they hadn't done it. In the same way, the boy who didn't like his parents because they were more reasonable and intelligent, 25 years later will respect them. But when the impact occurs, when we get what we want, God is ruling the universe. When we do not get what we want, the devil is in power. So looking around us, we have to begin to consider what love is. And whether love is giving us what we want, or assuring us what we need. The Tiger said, all men know what they want, but the gods alone know what they need. The disasters that afflict us, the burdens, misfortunes, and irritations that confound us, can just as well be a greater love than we know as something unpleasant and unfair. And in the approach of mysticism to life comes the simple process of coming to understand that the universe, with all its ups and downs, with all its trials and tribulations, with all its assorted comforts and discomforts, bears witness to an integration of purpose which has behind it and within it the greater good of all. The greater good against the immediate good. And that, therefore, the universe is the wise parent. And the wise parent is finally the loving parent. Thus we can overcome certain of these outrages that rise within our natures, and we can begin to experience the possibility of loving things that are not pleasant, loving things that are not going our way, loving persons who have the audacity to contradict us, loving a way of life that is hard rather than easy, because by its difficulties it hastens our own maturity. And little by little, the evil disappears out of the universe. And in the place of evil is strength. Strength serving us forever, but not serving our whims, serving our essential progress, and contributing to and hastening the day of our spiritual attainment. Now, to say this means very little. We can all say it. We can go home and be as miserable as we were before. But if, besides saying this, we are resolved within our natures to seek the good, and have a conviction in us that we wish to grow, we then take this intimate confidence, which is itself mostly emotional, that we have faith in this good. And that faith is something that is real and big inside of our emotional content. We can take this, and then we can allow the mind to go to work on it. And the mind working in this way begins to reveal to us a universal order rather than a universe of chaos. Little by little, observation, reflection, experimentation, and tradition contribute to the justification of our instinct that the universe is right. And slowly we come to a kind of respect, a kind of understanding, which in ourselves we know will never be subject to disillusionment. Father may be God to the 5-year-old, a demigod to the 10-year-old, and gradually loses face and countenance thereon. Until by the time the child grows up, Father is really not much better than anybody else, perhaps a little worse. But in the growth of man, the divine power, which is the concept of infinite power, is something for whom admiration grows with wisdom and releases more and more a realization of the wonderful workings of this planet and the infinite benevolence of this planet. That truly this great creating power is aware of the sparrow's fall, and that everything that exists is enclosed within the tremendous, compassionate understanding of something that is growing and unfolding through the creatures in its fashion, and is forever revealing itself as benevolent to those themselves benevolent, and is forever nourishing and nurturing and leading man gently toward obedience, and through obedience to identification with that universal power itself. One of the great examples of this mystery, this conflict, is death itself, which, while made naturally and inevitably ordained, is met with apprehension by the average person, who has not yet been able to find God in death, has not yet been able to realize that there is a larger life in which death itself is swallowed up, and that this larger life has a purpose, and that this phenomenon of death is an essential part of the benevolence of life. It is hard to appreciate these things, and yet we must come to do so. And gradually, through understanding, through the continuous meditation upon the universal good, we begin to experience the universe not as a vast pattern of laws, not as an enormous intellectual power, but as something of strangely subtle and compassionate immanence, something so near to us, something so much a part of ourselves that truly we are never alone, but are forever within a strange, wonderful affection which is as near to us as the air and the light and the sun. And the mystic begins to know this, begins to feel it. And in feeling it, he perceives it radiant in everything around him and in himself also. Because to find this love in every other thing and not find it in ourselves is also to fail. Gradually, through the refinement, therefore, of the available emotions of the individual, the capacity to love larger things, larger qualities and values, or as Plato expressed it, to transmute affection, elevate it from a devotion to forms until it becomes capable of being a devotion to ideas, later a devotion to principles, ultimately a devotion to being itself, which is the infinite root of all principles and all ideas. In the Buddhist metaphysical disciplines, the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, the Lord of Compassion, represents the transmutation of man's emotional life. A transmutation by means of which the individual turned gradually to the universalization of the power to love. This brings us to a second pattern that is very important. Namely, that to the average individual there are boundaries to the experience of his affections. He can find affection large enough to circumscribe that which belongs to himself. He can love his family. He can love his children. He can love his community. He can love his nation. But outside of the aura of his, in the sense of that which is accepted as part of himself, so that his love is all really self-love, because these things he loves because they are parts of him. They are his. Outside of that, it's a vacuum. And when word comes in the newspaper that 10 million Hindus have died of starvation, we say, well, that's just too bad. And yet we could not, for a moment, endure the thought of one of our own children dying of starvation. We simply are not capable of universalizing that emotion. We are not capable of an emotional experience beyond a certain gamut or a certain circle of experienced things. The individual sitting down cannot experience 10 million people dying of starvation. He is incapable of doing it. Unless, perchance, he was in the midst of that. Then he may have some concept. But if he has lived a life of security, if he's lived in a community where such things do not happen, his emotional nature simply cannot respond to it. Now, he may get a response from the level of hysteria. Some individuals get that also. He may generalize so completely on an archetypal pattern that the thought of anything, anywhere suffering, can cause him acute anguish. The fact that most folks have forgotten their own childhoods. This vital record is not available to them as an experience. It is subverted too much. Or then we simply try to go across the interval, reasoning with them from our own adult position and achieving practically no good. To reach them, we must reach back in ourselves to these children in ourselves. Immediately, the mental barrier is crossed, and we become alike. That which is alike can never be completely separated. Now, in the Buddhist doctrine, the bodhisattvic concept of compassion is the immediate remembrance of the experiences of being through which the enlightened creature has passed, and which, therefore, it can revitalize through meditation, and can relive all that is less than itself, because it has been all that is less than itself. It does not relive only the surface of its achievement, but all the way back to the degrees of its attainment. Thus, the bodhisattvic compassion represents the ability of the individual or the being to re-experience the need of all creatures. And in the Buddhist doctrine, the Bodhisattva Kuan Yin is the one experiencing the great soul need, the great soul hunger of all things that live. And experiencing that great soul hunger speaks to the disciple, to the student, to those who would serve. Feed my sheep. In other words, supply this hunger. Out of attainment, supply this need. So love experiences the world as need in the element or quality of compassion. This need is without boundary, without limit. Human and practical values may not permit the other to be boundless in his fulfillment of his instinct. But it makes this instinct transcend species, races, nations, types, creeds, religions, beliefs, anything of that kind. And to recognize the great hunger of life, as Damien called it. The great hunger. That everything that is imperfect is hungry. Terribly hungry. It is hungry for peace. It is hungry for love. It is hungry for growth, for understanding, for wisdom. But most of all, it is simply hungry and does not know what type of food or nourishment it requires. So as man experiences creatures evolving in life around him, he sees this great hunger. And then as he turns and experiences the abundance of the divine love, he sees the great nourishment, the tremendous nutrition that is available, and the great problem of bringing food to the hungry, bringing life to those who need it. This becomes the great work of love, the great work of sincere admiration and adoration in nature. In the yoga processes, the individual enters into meditational associations with these powers or qualities of which he seeks to attain. And in this discipline, one of the things that he is expected to achieve is the discovery of the universal in all things. He is supposed to be able gradually to become aware of an infinite life, an infinite identity of consciousness in all the forms and creatures of life. Thus we can say that in his meditation, let us say for the moment that he takes a flower, a rose, and we remember Dante, who was of such a strongly mystical nature that he could not look at an open rose without weeping and becoming almost hysterical. The sheer beauty of it moved in upon him with such a tremendous impact that it seemed to shatter his own whole existence. He was overwhelmed by the release of the divine through the magnificence of this flower. So in taking any object, a flower or anything else, the individual seeks to find in it or to experience through it the divine life that is forever present in it and manifesting in its growth. You can analyze the flower forever, but you will not find this. But it can be experienced by an immediate impact of consciousness. Suddenly, this impact strikes you, shattering entirely the integration of thought, practically removing the power of the individual to interpret that which he receives as impact. He simply knows. He simply intuitively accepts the divine release through the symbol. And he comes to recognize all forms and all bodies and all structures in nature as merely symbols of divine love. Symbols of universal beauty, harmony, peace, wisdom, all in one, releasing themselves forever to those who have the sensitivity, the internal consciousness to accept the impact of these symbols. Now it is obvious that the flower does not change, and it's obvious that these symbols remain as they are, flesh and bone, stone, wood, paint, marble. Therefore, the actual release is within the person himself. It is the release of his own love which causes him to find love in everything else. It is the release of his own divinity, forever reflected back to him from the forms around him in nature. It is then evident that he can never find these reflections, never experience them, unless he releases himself. But no matter how much he penetrates the symbol, he will never find the meaning, for the meaning is in him and not in the symbol. Under such realization and under such consideration, it becomes entirely necessary that the person refine and release his own internal potential of universal veneration or adoration. Until he achieves this, he cannot experience it in anything else. If then, he must make this achievement within himself. How does he do it? He does it by bringing numerous factors of life together. In India, for example, the young man who's going to take up the study of yoga finds himself or is appointed a teacher. Now, this teacher may be any elderly character, venerable appearance, and perhaps of wide reputation, who is known to be advanced in these matters. The boy first experiences his disciplines of yoga in his attitude toward this old man. The teacher is not a god. The boy perfectly well knows that. But the teacher is the custodian of a doctrine that is old, venerated, regarded, traditionally rich. This teacher is the keeper of the great culture of his race. The attitude toward the teacher then becomes the beginning of the experience and discipline. The boy's simple acceptance of the teacher, his natural respect for the teacher, his perfect willingness to follow according to the instruction of the teacher, his simple delight at doing well and receiving the applause of the teacher, his simple patience under the correction of the teacher. All of these things are parts of the beginning of the discipline. For little by little, the lad learns where values lie, and who is the teacher, and what is important in life. Now, the teacher isn't present much in the Western world, very seldom. So we have nature, life itself, as the teacher. If we do not venerate the teacher, we will never understand the teaching. Therefore, if we do not develop a simple, direct, gentle obedience to the laws governing life, if we do not accept the lessons of the day as bearing witness to the love of God, if we are not patient under the adversities of the time, recognizing them as good, not bad, until we achieve these levels, we are like the young Hindu lad who has not yet learned how to work with his teacher. Because whether it be the person or the world that teaches us, both are gurus, and both are to be regarded, respected, and revered. So we have life as our teacher. Life which we must learn to love. Not to be fooled by it, not to be deceived by it, but to recognize it for what it is. That we are supposed to live it, that we are supposed to meet it, make decisions, and that in daily conduct we are to live wisely, moderately, lovingly, constructively. Thus we obey, thus we venerate this great pattern itself. Until finally we can look out upon life and say, it is good. And when we honestly and truly mean that, we find several interesting things happen. First of all, life is not nearly as difficult as it was. I've heard many people say, and I've been asked myself, how an individual could keep on loving and accepting forever the misfortunes that he has to carry. The answer is, as soon as he starts loving and understanding, the misfortunes cease. They do not go on forever, because these misfortunes are the result of man's resistance to truth. They are not due to the presence of evil, but to the absence of wisdom and understanding in his own nature. Thus, the obedience to the teacher, the obedience to life, the acceptance of the laws governing life, all these result in a non-combative attitude toward life. Now, in the West, we say an individual who is non-combative is dead. We think that if a person is out shadow boxing inevitables all the time, he's a failure. He hasn't got anything. He lacks aggressiveness. He lacks that spark, that punch that is going to make him sell more full of brushes than any other man in the community. But in the East, the primary consideration is not selling full of brushes. And the individual learns that as he relaxes his own intemperances toward life, the shadows of adversity by which he is apparently surrounded begin to clear. And that just as eternal love, once found in himself, is then observed as everywhere present, so eternal discord, while it continues in the self, will be seen in everything else. By going out of conflict with the patterns of being, the individual begins to find his own difficulties falling away. We find that it is easier and easier to adjust. There is the conflict between personal will and universal will. As long as the individual is going to change the universe at all costs, he is going to be changed by the universe at all costs. But when he begins to adjust to laws, he begins to experience the beauty of them. He finds no conflict in laws he obeys. He finds no evil, no hate, no destruction in the laws he keeps, only in the laws he tries to break. So by degrees, through obedience, he experiences a lawful creation. And in experiencing a lawful creation, he also begins to apperceive that these laws are themselves the very substance of a divine regard. That actually, law and love are one. That they are not even polarities of each other. They are one entity, one being in space. For having discovered the goodness of law, we naturally love that which is good. And having discovered the legality of the world, we perceive also its lovability, that it is something that we cannot do, that can never fail us, and that is the cause of endless admiration. Thus the young disciple, having adjusted to the disciplines of his school, which are the disciplines of living, begins to go on under the guidance of his teacher. And as he goes on, more particular and specific problems are presented to him. Problems which at first he did not even know existed. The same happens in the school of life. When we have broken through the outer crust of error or illusion, and have begun to go forward toward a greater enlightenment, then we begin to experience larger and more amazing patterns of requirement. We see that all these patterns challenge us. They present to us descriptions, forms, and symbols, inviting us to proceed, inviting us to obey still more perfect laws, still more complete patterns or archetypes. and these become the bases of specific disciplines, laws, rules, patterns, abiding forever in space. As the disciple continues on with these experiences, there is a sublimation inevitably in his nature. But I feel that here in the West, this problem of sublimation must be very carefully handled. The West is not aesthetic by nature. We are persons long grounded in objectivity. Our world is a visible world. Our problems are immediate and tangible. Also, our relationships with others are very much objective. And in many religious movements here in the Western world, and to some degree this is true in the East, there is a tendency always to depart from the profane and hasten toward the sacred. This is bad yoga regardless of how it may be deified by term or poem or sutra. Actually, man never moves from the profane to the sacred, because these are conditions of one thing. A child is not the polar opposite of a man, nor does man by will move from being a child to being an adult. It is a condition of growth. The child in the man never dies. It is matured. It expands, it extends, it releases more and more of its own potential. But the child is not divorced from the man, but transformed into the man. If we cast off our lower emotions, so-called, and try to throw them into limbo, we cannot get rid of them. It's a peculiar thing. When we throw our lower emotions away, we have to throw ourselves with them, because there is no separation. Thus, the individual who is forever trying to get rid of the lower and rush on to the higher is assuming the existence of two things where only one exists. Thus, the person cannot be in the situation legitimately of being better than he wants to be. And that is something that is quite common in our modern religious experience. The individual who is just too good to do what he feels like doing. The individual, I remember one who decided that he, for his spiritual salvation, was going to refrain from certain types of food. He was working along that line rather assiduously. He wouldn't eat hotcakes. They were too starchy, and besides that, the maple sugar was too rich and might damage some of the gentle and subtle parts of his etheric double, or something of that nature. He was too wise, too noble, too wonderful to eat them, but not too wise, too noble, or too wonderful to stand in front of Child's restaurant while they were making the hotcakes in the window and drooling by the hour. So, of course, we like to try to clarify. He was an individual trying desperately to be better than he was. He wanted them that badly, he should have eaten them, because in his internal life he had already eaten hundreds of them. In some way, he simply lacked the courage to go in and order them. And he believed that he was really making a heroic spiritual sacrifice. It was a sacrifice of some kind, but it wasn't spiritual. Now, the individual who is desperately afraid that he's going to leave a lot of human happiness behind on his way to divine bliss is really not in any emergency, even though he may think that he is. The way of growth is not along a path of regrets. Growth is a perfectly natural unfoldment of emotions, by which these changes are as subtle as the growth of a child. From day to day there is no shock. The individual finds that his interests, his inclinations, his tastes, his attitudes, everything gradually develops. until he continues to express his affections always in the simplest and most natural way to himself. And until that condition is achieved, there is no essential emotional progress. After that time, he's only fooling himself. He is never in the position where, wishing to be kind, he must bite his lip for fear he will not be. Or having the desire to say the unpleasant word that he must grind his teeth to keep his spirituality intact. These things cannot exist. That is a delusion that we have in the West that has done much to make spiritual growth seem almost a penalty upon life. A horrible thing, a terrible sacrifice in which we should all gain martyrs' crowns merely from the fact we tried. This is not the way it is. There's no resemblance. These things grow. Affection grows. Qualities of affection refine. Emotions become transmuted by a gradual process. But always the individual in a completely relaxed condition and without trying to be better than or worse than he is should express the level of his own attainment. And will do so. He needs not fight it, he needs not defend it. It simply expresses. And until it does so, it is not attained. But through living and through thoughtfulness, through understanding, through the rich desire of the spirit to grow, these procedures become natural, easy, reasonable, happy. And the person moves on from an intense addiction to physical things to a greater recognition of the qualities in things. This happens where persons who have been happily married over a period of years watch the changes taking place within their own natures and in the nature of their partners without being particularly upset. It is quite possible, for example, that looking back upon the years, the woman would not have married 20 years before. The husband she did marry, if he looked then as he does now. She would say he is too old, he is no longer pleasant, he is putting on a little weight, the hair is getting a little thin, there's a little sag around the corner of the mouth. 20 years ago, if he looked like that, she wouldn't have married him. But today, she doesn't even notice that he looks like this. He has grown older with him. They have grown up together. Gradually, the tremendous importance of experience has given way to the camaraderie of character, to the deepening of understanding, the strengthening of the bonds of interests. And this person, older today, is more handsome, more wonderful than they were before, because new values have come into existence. And it's the same thing in the affections of the human being towards nature, toward the universe, and toward God. These things unfold. We would no longer be satisfied with the adolescent standards we started with, and we should not be. We would be no longer desirous of possessing. We have long reached the joy of releasing. There is no struggle. We're not giving up something we want to hold on to. Once we wanted to hold, so we held. Now we wish to release, so we release. And both of these are equally joyous occasions, if we have grown. So all the conflict and struggle to be good, and to try to love something we don't like, these things disappear in the growth of consciousness, in the unfoldment of the conscious nature within us. And we go on toward that larger recognition of our own ultimates. In youth, we are ambitious. We want to be somebody. If we get a little older, we're not quite so sure we're ever going to be somebody. As we get still older, we pray that we may be delivered from being and figure that if we can just have that little farm out in the country somewhere, we're going to be perfectly contented to settle for that, even though in early life we have been craving millions, position, authority, all these things. We have grown in our moods. Now in our loves, we have also this growing. The adolescent, the savage, the primitive human being, loving God, loves the power of God and tries to draw it to himself for his own use. The mature human being rather recognizes the grace of God and hopes that he may be able to accept that grace and share in it and give himself to that grace rather than to demand or require. Also, there comes a time in the evolution of the human being when he gradually becomes more and more suspicious of his own ego. The young person is not. The young person is always right anyway. It takes him a long time to realize that he isn't right in anything. But the young person believes in himself. As we grow older, we're not quite so sure of ourselves. When we were 20, we were always right. When we are 40, we are sometimes right. And by the time we are 60, we are seldom right. And we're not awfully unhappy over the discovery. Because actually, with these maturities have come also other values that make it less desirable that we should always be right. So we take it in stride. So in the young spirit growing up, is tremendously concerned with itself. The personal pronoun simply dominates every other consideration. And for this vertical pronoun, the individual is willing to give and sacrifice everything else. Gradually, as he proceeds along the path of evolution, he begins to doubt this personal self. This self which he loved to think of as first mortal, then immortal. Mortal while he went to college, immortal after he gets out of college. And so he goes. But as he goes in understanding that in himself, he begins to realize that perhaps this self that he has been so addicted to is really a larger problem than it is worth. That instead of being the source of his power, it is the cause of his difficulty. So as he proceeds gradually along the mystical path as recognized in the ancient systems, he begins to realize that this self is an eternal limitation. That it causes him always to stand somewhere and look something over. He stands off and he says, I like that, I don't like that. Or he stands over somewhere else and he tries to analyze this and he tries to analyze that. And he goes so far as to stand there and try to figure out God. And he begins to try to contemplate what God is like. He examines God as he can find it in his works, adds this up, subtracts that, considers this, weighs that, looks for the latest findings, compares them with the first findings, and in the end is an observer of phenomena. He's never broken through it. And as he goes along doing this, he comes finally to the realization that he is never going to find God. Because as long as he is separate from God and can estimate God, he will never experience God. So in the Yogas, we have this point that is so controversial in Western philosophy, namely the final transition from self to universal. And this comes in our experience of love. A very simple example of that is the parent, the father or mother, who in an emergency will usually sacrifice a life for the child. If there must be one that will go on, the parent will give his for his child if he loves that child. And he does not regard it as a sacrifice. It may be so labeled by others who come after him, who will refer to his nobility and so on. But to him, it was instinct. It was the inevitable that this child was some way something that had to go on. And if one had to perish, the parent would die for the child. We have the same in larger political patterns. The hero who dies for his country. Not one who has been forced to by draft law, but one who actually goes out and puts the good of his country above himself and willingly sacrifices himself for it. What has he done? He has done the biggest thing he knows how to do, because he has destroyed voluntarily the most important thing he knows, self. Perhaps he believes in immortality, but doesn't know it. He cannot. He can only believe it. Therefore, he has taken a supreme chance of passing into a state of non-existence. He has sacrificed the symbol of his selfhood in order to protect the selfhood in something else. This is the biggest thing he knows how to do, and it becomes a symbol of something he does later. It becomes ultimately the symbol of the greatest love that man can know. And that is the love which is the voluntary sacrifice of self to the beloved. The beloved in this case is truth, reality, God. To which this voluntary sacrifice is no longer something that was a great pain, something that required tremendous decision, but the next and inevitable impulse of reunion or identification with the beloved. A man discovers that as he approaches the mystery of universal love, he approaches with it the mystery of universal wisdom and universal life, and they are one. Therefore, there comes the time in the disciplines where there is only one great emotion left in him as an individual, and that is the tremendous longing to be one with the eternal. This is found in the dervish poems of Sadi and many of them, Jani and many of the others. It is this tremendous willingness, this eagerness to cease forever in the beloved. And in the Bhakti Yoga we come in the disciplines ultimately to this point, that it is not a desperate desire for truth that lures us on. It is not a determination to solve the mystery even if we have to die to do it. It is not any pressure from within ourselves at all of that nature. It is an infinite longing to be one again with totality. To return as the drop of water to the shining sea. To be one once more with that which has been the end of seeking and the end of hoping and the end of loving. That the individual shall no longer love, but that the individual shall be love itself, and become one and complete with this tremendous moving power of the world. So in this complete ecstasis found in the practice of yoga, the individual experiences temporarily the immanence of love, finding it an immense and intangible sensitivity, infinitely tender, infinitely strong, so that there is only the one tremendous desire, and that is to be one with it, to be united with it forever in an eternal relation, an eternal reunion, or yoga, with this tremendous power. Now, how does the mystic interpreting this, how does he define this experience of love? Does he explain it or define it in human emotions at all? No. It has gone far beyond that by the time he is capable of even experiencing the shadow of infinite. It has gone to the point where to him love is an entirely different thing from what we know. Love is an infinite sharing. It is an infinite giving of self forever. It is the divine power, moving forever towards a not-selfness. It is the divine that is divine because it forever is. And in this, the mystic experiences eternal or divine love as the ever bestowing, that which is ever giving and never demanding. And therefore, that which, because it never demands, receives all. And because it gives forever, possesses all. So this is the great contrast. What it is like to one on the material plane. What we hold, we lose. What we give, we keep. Therefore, the perfect love which holds nothing and gives all, actually holds all, and everything returns to it again by the very process of its own eternal unselfishness. And in this Lord also, the mystic experiences the infinite experience of absolute security. Not personal security, not that the individual is now safe forever, but the condition or state of an eternal security to which there can never be a deficiency, and which there can never be a condition. The state of absolute faith, transformed from our term of faith to the faith of utter knowing. Also the experience of absolute good, and that this absolute good is the end of all seeking after good, and all paths and all roads lead finally to the heart of truth. And the heart of truth is this power which ever protects, ever guards, ever preserves, and yet never occupies an aggressive relation to anything that exists. Everything that seeks it must flow into it, and in flowing into it, returns to the sovereignty of its own source. Thus man, as a creature, as he knows himself, is a condition of this, is a mood of it, is a temporary passing form of it, whereas this eternal power itself is the complete and unchanging continuity of absolute love. The mystic approaching it is filled with a sudden and complete realization of the heart of God. The recognition that as the laws of God are infinite, so is the heart. That the mind of God is all-pervading, so is the heart. But that as in man, the mind is only justifying the heart, so in God, the wisdom of God is only justifying the love of God. This is a very important mystical point. It may take a little time for it to be thoroughly assimilated into consciousness. But the divine wisdom sustains the divine love. For the great sun, the great central light of the universe, according to Bhakti Yoga, is God as infinite love. Infinite wisdom protects, manifests love. Infinite law reveals love. Infinite truth leads to love, or stays love forever. But all these are the manifestations of the one thing itself, which is infinite, timeless, eternal regard, a complete and mysterious devotion that extends throughout space to the end of time. And in this mystical apperception, the individual experiencing it, coming closer to it, comes toward the heart of reality and finds the greatest dream and hope of his life and consciousness fulfilled in that tremendous moment in which, as a being, he is absorbed in the love of God. This is his natural, conceivable end. And beyond that, he does not even care to go. He does not know. But the life which begins in pain ends in this love. And he visualizes existence as the cycle of love to love, through truth and wisdom and law. And in this pattern, he has an inward meditation. in meditation of the continual remembering of this, the visualizing it, and as it arises in his consciousness, opening his eyes and beholding it shining in the world around, until light and life and power, until the earth and the sun and the moon, the stars, the flowers, the creatures, are all radiant with this tremendous eternal power. Then the universe is in order. Doubts and fears cease. And the mystic, happily and gloriously, seeks final union with the beloved, finding in that union the end of waiting, the end of all doubt and fear, and the beginning of a life beyond conception, something he knows nothing of, and admits it immediately, but does not need to know, because what do we need to know about the beloved, except that which is told to us by our own hearts? Do we question our love? Do we question that which is the substance of our desire? Do we ask the beloved name or definition? Do we demand? No. We give only. And in giving we find all. So from the beginning of our human search, we approach by giving, we hesitate by gaining. And as we give more, we grow more. And these little interludes of false security are hours of sleep and rest along the road, because it is through the sharing, the giving, the renouncing, that we serve the beloved. And finally, through all giving, become one with the all-giver. It is hard to say these things, but perchance something of what we mean will filter through. And you can understand why in mysticism and in the yoga, particularly Bhakti, we have a tremendous emphasis upon the final act of union, which is the individual, who finally gives the last, having given all that he has, in the sense not of material things, but in the sense of proprietorship over things. Having given all that he has only one thing to give, and that is all that he is. And in giving of that, he makes the final offering, which is acceptable to the beloved. And in this action, proves that he is the truth seeker and the truth lover. And by having demonstrated and proved this, moves magnificently and serenely into this great thousand-petaled flower of infinite love, and vanishes as a light amidst the great light of the cosmic heart. These are the symbols. You must read them and understand them according to your own heart and according to your own souls.